Hello and welcome to this edition of The Interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons and my guest today is Kemal Kirisci, who's the director of the Centre on the US and Europe's Turkey Project at the Brookings in Washington and the director of the Turkey Project Policy Papers series. And Turkey has rarely seemed so important. The country votes in a referendum on Sunday, April the 16th, that could dramatically change the constitution by heavily concentrating powers in the hands of the presidency. A vote in favour would mark the biggest political change in Turkey since Kemal Ataturk founded the republic in 1923. Thank you, Kemal Kirisci, for joining us on The Interview. If I could start by looking at the issue of what sort of system of government there is in Turkey. At the moment, it's a parliamentary democracy, and that's been the case for 94 years. How dramatic are the changes that are being proposed by this referendum?
I think they're fairly dramatic. You underlined that powers are going to be concentrated in the hands of the president, and what the amendments would also be doing is weakening the checks and balances that is so critical to the functioning of a democracy. And as you also pointed out, it would transform Turkey's parliamentary system that has been in place since 1946. When Turkey moved from a one-party system to a two-party system into a presidential system.
But Mr. Kirisci, parliamentary democracy, and I'm sure this is something that President Erdogan would argue, parliamentary democracy hasn't always served Turkey that well. 65 governments in the 94 years since Kemal Ataturk founded the republic.
Yes, there was a coup in 1960. And then there was the military interfering with the flow of civilian politics in 1971, followed by the dramatic military intervention in 1980, which drew up the current constitution that came into force in 1982. Subsequently, there was the so-called postmodern coup in 1997, where the military forced the civilian government to dissolve, and then the infamous coup attempt in 2007. Subsequently, as you may be aware, there were indictments and court cases brought against a group of military officers as well as civilians in 2008. And then finally, there was the coup attempt of July 2016.
So is President Erdogan right to say that Turkey needs these changes?
In some ways, it's... The government side is arguing that these changes are going to make it easier to govern the country, is going to make it easier to meet the challenges of Turkey, and will make government more efficient and effective. The irony of this claim is that this government, led by the current president of Turkey, who was then the prime minister, created miracles in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, when Turkey was being touted as a model of liberal democracy and a dynamic economy for the neighborhood and beyond its neighborhood. So it's a little bit puzzling that the current system is being challenged at a time when the people who ran this country did such a great job back then.
Yes.
Since then, clearly the world has changed, the neighborhood has changed, the challenges have increased, but some of those challenges are a function of the current president politics becoming increasingly authoritarian and undermining, weakening some of the pillars of a functioning democracy, for example, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and most importantly, the rule of law.
But President Erdogan,
these constitutional amendments
President Erdogan would argue that Turkey is the sort of society that requires a more concentrated power, that requires a presidential system. And others would say, too, what's wrong with a presidential system as long as the checks and balances are there? Look at France, look at the United States.
Well, as long as part of what you have just said is very critical. France, the United States, are presidential system, but they have very strong checks and balances. Let me give you a concrete example. The prime minister's position would be taken away, and rather than have a cabinet composed of deputies from a parliament, the president would choose his own vice president and his ministers. Unlike in the United States, these persons would not go through a confirmation process, eliminating a very critical process of checks and balances. When we look at the judiciary, we see a similar situation. The Constitutional Court, the highest judicial body of the country, as well as the body that appoints and then sees through the promotion of judges and prosecutors, would be dominated by members that would be selected by the president, but also by the parliament. But then, unlike in the past, this president would at the same time be the leader of his own party. So if you have a parliament that is dominated by the party of the president, you then come across a judiciary that is composed of members that are selected by the president and by his political party. How can then one expect that the judiciary would actually be able to function as an independent one? And these members would not go through a confirmation process the way they do it here in the United States. And recently we saw the process with the appointment of a new judge to the American Supreme Court.
Absolutely. How dangerous do you think this sort of winner-takes-all approach of President Erdogan, and to a degree also the AK party, in a society which is so heterogeneous, a society in which social, religious, ethnic divisions are so pronounced?
I think what made many people think and believe that the previous AKP governments and Erdogan's leadership was so miraculous was that in 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, we saw reforms that increasingly adjusted Turkish politics towards the reality that you just described, a reality of diversity. And the more plural the society became, or the politics of Turkey and its laws became, the more Turkey was looked upon as a model. It was also a Turkey where its economy also began to grow in very impressive rates. It was also a Turkey that developed this infamous zero problems with neighbors policy. And now what we're seeing is a departure, if you want, rather a return to the kind of politics and governance we had back, for example, in the 1990s, when the system ignored, overlooked that diversity you're making references to.
Mr. Kirisci, I'd just like to ask...
diversity is not acknowledged...
Yeah. If I could interrupt you, Mr. Kirisci, we're coming towards the end of the programme now, and I'd like to ask you a question about the referendum itself. Is it possible that this could be a fair contest, given the circumstances in which the vote is taking place? A state of emergency, arrests of journalists, 50,000 people arrested since the coup d'etat, and so on and so forth. In those circumstances, can one possibly have a fair contest?
Well, that's what makes this referendum a very sad one. It's a very important referendum. It's bringing very critical changes to the country's governance. But the country has not been exposed to a fair, balanced debate and discussion of the actual content of those amendments and what the implications would be in the long term. And as you pointed out earlier on, the media is very much under the control of the government. There are a large number of journalists as well as academics who are behind bars. And what is truly saddening and hurtful is that there has been a number of leading personalities who have argued that no voters would be considered as terrorists and traitors.
And that I'm afraid, Mr. Kirisci, is where we have to end it. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thanks very much to our guest, Mr. Kemal Kirisci, and thank you to the viewers as well for being with us. But don't go away, more news to follow.